Now I got to pick up with one thing. I said it very quickly. This is the point that late on Tuesday afternoon, Jesus pronounces those woes upon the Pharisees, and that's very, very deliberately. It's designed to drive the people to a decision. And then on the way back to Bethany that night, he preaches the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24 and 25. I'm not going to go there, but foretells his coming and so on. And this is what I said before. Late on Tuesday evening, Judas sneaks off to the Sanhedrin and bargains to help them arrest Jesus. Now, 2 points to be made really quickly. Number one is that all right, in telling the story of Judas's betrayal, both Matthew and Mark, very interestingly, insert the story of that Saturday night feast in the middle of their Tuesday night narrative. Now, they don't record it as this is Matthew 26 and Mark 14. They don't record it as having happened on Tuesday night, but they tell you that Tuesday night, this is what Jesus says, 2 days from now is the Passover. And then Matthew says that the Sanhedrin is gathered at the personal home of Caiaphas the high priest. And that personal home is on a city. Listen, this is important because in just a moment we'll talk about the fact that Jesus was taken to the priestly villa in the walled city of Caiaphas. So Caiaphas has a priestly villa in the walled city of Jerusalem, which actually belongs to whoever is the high priest. It's the high priestly villa, but he's been there for 18 years. He also has a personal villa, home, estate, down south of the city on a hill called, to this day, the Hill of Evil Counsel. That's the formal name for it. And it's because it remembers the place to which Judas went to take counsel to put Jesus to death. And that's why it's called the Hill of Evil Counsel. Now we all giggle because we all know that the other God has a sense of humor, and that hill is dominated today. You can look from anywhere and see that hill, and up there on the hill is the headquarters of the United Nations. So God has a sense of humor, but that's entirely different. But the point is that Tuesday, now, so this is what Matthew and Mark both say. So Jesus says it's 2 days of the Passover. That means it's Tuesday night. And meanwhile, the Sanhedrinists took counsel to put Jesus to death, but they said not during the feast, lest there be an uproar. And at that point, the story of not during the Passover feast, not during the Passover week, let there be an uproar. And at that point, both Matthew and Mark insinuate the story of that feast that happened last Saturday night, where Mary anointed Jesus, Mary was rebuked, Jesus corrected them. And the reason is, I think, because what they're telling us, Matthew and Mark, is it was that quiet rebuke that wasn't even specific to Judas that so angered the bitter, unsaved heart of Judas that it festered for a couple of days, and finally, when he had opportunity, he went down and made that deal. That makes sense to you? Because what happens is, again, back to Matthew 26, there were 2 days, the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, both Pharisees and Sadducees got together at the house of Caiaphas. We got to kill him, not during the feast. And then the story stops. And then you have the story of the feast, and it's told as a flashback when Jesus was in Bethany. And then again, it picks the story up and says, along came Judas, and Judas made the deal. Does that make sense to you? So I think all right, this is a lot. I shouldn't have got into this, but that's what Matthew and Mark do, both of them. Matthew and Mark are 2 days before the Passover, took counsel to kill him, not during the feast. Story of the anointing, Judas came and made the bargain. This is Luke. He doesn't tell us the story of that feast. This is Luke. Remember, they're synoptic. 2 days before the Passover, Sanhedrin just took counsel, put him to death, not during the feast, and then Satan entered Judas. Where Matthew and Mark have the story of the feast, Luke simply says Satan entered Judas, and he went and made the bargain. I think that's the point. Matter of fact, I wonder, I'm going to check someday when I get there, but I wonder if this maybe isn't what Paul has in mind when he says, let not the sun go down on your wrath, neither give place to the devil. Because what happened is Judas stewed on that. That simmered in his broken, unsaved heart for 3 days, and when he had the opportunity, he went off and made the bargain. Now, here's the other thing that needs to be said. What was the bargain? What was Judas hired to do? And I'm going to tell you, there is almost universal confusion about this, and I'm way too much hubris in this, but honestly, I know where it comes from, and that is the idea that Judas was hired to identify Jesus. The Sanhedrin wanted to arrest Jesus, but they couldn't pick him out of a lineup. Now let's think. Is there a better known set of human features anywhere than the Nazarene who rode into the city last Sunday, and the whole city welcomed as king, and then possessed the temple for 2 days? The problem is not that they don't know, they can't pick him out of a crowd. Where that idea comes from, obviously, is the kiss. Because when Judas makes the bargain, he says, the one whom I kiss is the one. That's for the soldiers. The Romans do not allow any of their constituent peoples, and certainly the troublesome Jews, any independent force of arms. They didn't have police, they didn't have soldiers. Now, Rome would assign certain soldiers, for instance, to the Sanhedrinists, so they kind of work for the Sanhedrin. But if you're going to arrest somebody, especially given the fact that there is a riot on the horizon, you just got to anticipate it. If they go out and get Jesus, there's liable to be a riot. That's why they do it undercover night and so on. But the point is, you're going to have soldiers. And the Bible says in John 18 that Judas came with a cohort. Now, that's a formal term, and it's variously defined, but it's somewhere around 600 soldiers who come to arrest Jesus. Now, my point is those soldiers don't know who Jesus is. Does that make sense to you? So the kiss is for the soldiers. Well, then what was Judas hired to do? We are left with absolutely no doubt, and it is hugely helpful. So let me take you to Luke 22 and verse 6. This is his telling of that time when Judas sneaked off to the house of Caiaphas. Now that detail's not in Judas; it's in Matthew and Mark. But at any rate, it says Satan entered Judas, and he went and conferred with the chief priests and captains how he might betray him to them. They were glad and agreed to give him money. Now here it is. So he promised and sought opportunity to betray Jesus to them in the absence of the multitude. Again, this is the problem that they have, that they can't get Jesus in the absence of the multitude. Now, on Tuesday night, late, get this, on Tuesday night, late, the Sanhedrinists, having acknowledged that they can't get this done during the feast, lest there be a riot among the people. You have this in verse 2 there, that they sought how they might kill him. All right, now listen, be sensitive to this. Develop some antenna. Chief priests, those are the Sadducees, and scribes. They hate each other. They can't agree on anything. They are bitter enemies. But they are of one mind here. They want to see Jesus dead. This is the Sanhedrin. This is what happened because of the cleansing of the temple and so on. But anyway, they're galvanizing the hatred. But they feared the people. And here, you see it, Matthew 26. Yeah. They plotted to take Jesus by trickery and kill him, but they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people, just to beat it to death. Here it is again in Mark. The chief priests and scribes sought how they might take him by trickery and put him to death. They said, not during the feast. Again, at that point, the story is suspended, and it tells you about the feast. And then down here, they pick the story up again. Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, promised. Well, at any rate, my point is that all right, on Tuesday night, this whole process, this whole wicked process, we're going to eventuate with Jesus on a cross on Friday morning. The whole process cannot begin until late Tuesday night, because on Tuesday night they're saying we can't get it done. But along comes Judas, and he says, no, I can help you arrest him in the absence of the multitude. And let me just tell you something. The fact that the Jewish leadership went ahead with this, I wish I could communicate what an absolutely volatile, incendiary situation here is for everybody. The Romans, Pilate's job, his life is on the line. He's supposed to keep, and he got Sunday, Monday, Tuesday ringing in his ears. So he's got every reason to believe these people are going to support Jesus, not going to put up with it if they try to put him on arrest. And then you've got the Romans, the Sanhedrinists. Why would they not say, look, this thing could explode if it does, and we're behind it. Our heads literally are going to roll. We're going to wind up on our own crosses. Why would they not say, guys, why don't we wait till Monday? Everybody will have gone home, and then we'll be able to do it. No. They are so unhingedly mad, angry, just that they say, okay, we got the opportunity. We're going to do it. And so beginning late Tuesday night, there is laid in place a plot that is all about, now hear me on this, getting Jesus arrested, tried, sentenced, and on his way to execution while the city sleeps. That's the whole thing here. If the city wakes up, they're gonna explode over this. But if we can get it done to where he's actually on his way to Roman execution, by the time they wake up, what are they going to do? Now that's the plot, and it's laid on Tuesday night. And it begins with Judas. Okay, this is the other thing. When it says in Luke 22 that he promised to help them arrest him in the absence of the multitude, don't get the idea that he's going to follow Jesus around. Ooh, nobody's around. Okay, send up a flare or something. He knows the next time Jesus is going to be in the absence of the multitude. And that's at the Passover. It's Tuesday night. You have to gather indoors, and the rabbinical rule was that you couldn't have more than 20 or fewer than 10 on a Passover lamb. And Judas undoubtedly knew that it would be Jesus and the 12, and it has to be indoors. So the whole key is, I'm going to wait, and as soon as I know, I'll let you know. All right, that makes sense? That happens on Tuesday night. All right. Now, I have some notes on Wednesday. I'm going to say it very quickly. You know what? I should say this, too. Hold on here. Folks, what do I have here next? All right, so that's Sunday. And then Wednesday is a silent day in the record. And I'm going to put this all on the screen. Don't worry about it. I'll go through it very quickly. First of all, folks, I'm going to take a time out. I think I gave you, I'm sure I did, because I always do. Toward the end of your notes, there is a 2-page chart regarding the day of Jesus. Do I have that? Yeah, it's on page 21 and 22. Now listen, I'm not going to go there. Listen, this is a solid, well-taught church for many, many years, and it's very possible, and it's very legitimate, that there is a difference of opinion as to the weekday on which Jesus died. I am teaching that he died on Friday. There are many believe he died on Thursday. Now, listen, I got the microphone, okay, but I'm trying to be fair. And in that chart, I try and give you all the arguments on both sides, and so I want to be fair. And this is absolutely an intramural, fraternal, irenic discussion. This is not us against them. This is just a disagreement among us, okay? And it's a legitimate. So let me give you the case for Friday very quickly. Every indication in the record is that he died on Friday. Every indication. I mean, they wanted to take his body off the tree because it was the day of preparation. Know this. The Jews do not name the days of the week. They number them, so, except for one. So there's the first day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, day of preparation. That's what they call it. Because whatever you want to do, on today, on Shabbat, a Jewish person cannot turn on a light. You can't switch a light, So because the Bible says you shouldn't start a fire, and there's a spark there. That's why they can't get in the car, because there's a spark plug. And so anything they want to eat, there are special Jewish ovens which can be set to come on and go off, and come on and go off, and so on, so that you can warm things up, because you have to get all the food ready before the sun goes down on Friday. And by the way, if you're going to have a party at the coming out of Shabbat, you have to get that ready too, because you can't do anything on. All right, so the point is, the Bible says, gospel is absolutely clear, they wanted to take the body off the cross because it was preparation day, and they didn't want the body on Sabbath. Now, to read that is to say it was Friday, and it wasn't, right? Okay. Why? What's the problem with Friday? And it's not an insignificant issue. What is it? Talk to me. What is it? 3 days and 3 nights. If it's on Friday, how can it be 3 days and 3 nights? Look, folks, that's a legitimate issue. It's only once, Matthew 12 and verse 40, that Jesus says, as Jonah was in the heart of the earth, the belly of the whale, I will be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. He only uses that once, but it's in the Bible. There's no doubt about it. There are about 40 times where Jesus, or somewhere in the Gospels, says that he arose on the third day. On the third day I will rise again. This is the gospel I preach now, how Jesus was crucified according to the Scripture, he was buried and rose on the third day. So the Bible's inerrant in all of its parts, and so the third day is synonymous to 3 days and 3 nights. That's a problem. Now, if you want to look on that chart, on the second page, on the back of that, what was it, about page? I give you what I think is a perfectly adequate way to settle that, to reconcile all that, because down toward the bottom, about under number 4, the second number 4, about 2/3 of the way down, I give you a quote, and this is much bandied, but there is from the Talmud, that is from the body of Jewish commentary and legend and history and so on. There is a quote from a rabbi from the 1st century. That is, he lived in the 1st century. And you understand, he's a rabbi. He's not a believer. He's not a Christian. And he's not talking about the death of Jesus. I don't know what the context is, to be honest with you. But he is just talking about the way the Jewish people used the language. And he makes this statement. It's there for you. He says, so I say, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, from about 100, counted the, but he says, a day and night are an ona. Now, an ona means it's a unit, it's a piece. So it's one unit. And then he says, any a portion of time, and the portion of an ona is as the whole of it. So what he is saying is, when we talk about 3 days and 3 nights, we're not talking about 72 hours, and it's impossible to get 72 hours out, to be honest with you. But we're just talking about any portion of, this, I don't know if this relates, but in the Old Testament, when all the chronological figures, Old and New Testament, you have to understand that when they would say, this king reigned for X number of years, any portion of a year is a year. That makes sense to you? So any portion is a year. And so I think by the same token, any portion of a day night is a day night. And so what he is saying is that, the point is that if Jesus dies on Friday and his body is in the tomb before sundown on Friday, that's a day night. Saturday, all day. Sunday, portion of the day. So on the basis of the way the Jewish people use the language, according to that Talmudic quote, it makes all the sense that 3 days and 3 nights is entirely synonymous with the 3 days. That makes sense? And I'll tell you one other thing here. I shouldn't go here, but I've never seen anybody else appeal to this, but it makes sense to me. If he was crucified on Thursday, there are some who believe Wednesday, almost nobody did. That was W. Graham Scroggie in days gone by, but today, the division is between those who believe he died on Thursday and those who believe he died on Friday. And those who believe he died on Thursday are simply working to settle the 3 days and 3 nights. Well, I think that's easily settled, but here's the issue. In my mind, if he died on Thursday, then that would have been day 1. You can only treat the body for 3 days. Day 1, Friday, day 2, day 3, Saturday, that tomb would have been closed permanently. And the reason is because it's gotten so wretched you can't handle it. You don't open. Remember Martha? You can't open it. It's the 4th day. What were those women going to do on Sunday morning? See the point? You've run out of days. If he dies on Friday, 3 days and 3 nights can be calculated by their reasoning to be Sunday morning. Now his body is still available to be treated. All right, so leave that alone. Let me come back to another thing real quickly. There is some dispute over the Silent Wednesday. Because if you put, and maybe it wouldn't hurt at this point, I give you a chart on page, and there's actually a better chart in that drop box. I've improved it somewhat. But, where is it? I'm finding it. Yeah. On page 7, there is this chart of the days of the Passion Week. Now, it's a little incomplete because I really should start back there on Friday when they arrived in Bethany, and I have that chart on your notes. But all I want you to see on this chart is, this says Friday. I'm sorry. This is the full one. But notice that you have Jesus, the triumphal entry on Sunday, Monday and Tuesday proclamation, and then Wednesday is a silent day. Now, what I mean by that is that there is no record of what happened on Wednesday. And some people, not the least of whom, frankly, was Harold Hoehner, the most important evangelical chronologist of our day, and my professor, and I love him dearly, and we had fun with this, but he didn't like the silent day. And his reasoning was simply, you got this week that's so carefully detailed, and would they jump a whole day? And so he put the triumphal entry on Monday. And as I said to him, whoever heard of Palm Monday? Is that working for you? But maybe other reasons at stake. But I'll leave it alone. I absolutely reject. And this has been, by the way, although there have been, the chronology I'm giving you is the one that has prevailed. Now, you don't do theology or history by consensus, but in point of fact, this has been the overwhelmingly widely accepted chronology. So I'm not the odd guy out by any means, but I think Wednesday was silent. But here's the thing: I think you need it, because think about this. And one other point, real quickly: your faith is grounded in history, and that's a historical record. And you know what? It has to be coherent. You can't just assume because it's Bible history there can be nonsense or things can happen that couldn't possibly happen. And the fact is, I think in order to make the week coherent, you have to realize that the plot that was laid late on Tuesday could not have been sprung the next afternoon. You need Silent Wednesday to get everything in place. And what that includes is, number one, you have to arrange for 600 soldiers, a cohort of soldiers, to come, John 18:2, with armor, weapons, and lanterns. Now, you don't just knock on a door and say, quick, I need 600. You're going to have to go through. You're going to have to go to the Roman, to Pilate, and he's going to have to give the order to the captain of the forces there at the Antonia, and they're going to have to make ready and so on. Then, after not only the 600, but then there is going to be a hearing, and we're going to talk about it in just a minute, before the Sanhedrin at somewhere around very late, somewhere well after dark. We'll talk about it. Now, the Sanhedrin is 70, mostly very old men, and they live in various places all around the city and its environs. And you can't get a messenger there any faster than you get a person there. So you're going to have to send all these runners out and get them ready. And it's going to be, so my point is, it's going to take a lot of preparation to get those Sanhedrins all alerted to the fact that we think we got them, and you need to report to Caiaphas' villa in the walled city. But then the big one perhaps is, at about 4:30 in the morning, Jesus is going to be taken to Pilate, and there's going to be the Roman trials. And you remember that because the Jewish leaders didn't want to defile themselves by going into the praetorium, the Roman domicile, that they had arranged for Pilate to bring his whole jurisprudential apparatus onto a gatehouse. So again, there is a lot of preparation. That makes sense to you? So I'm saying I think Wednesday makes a lot of sense. And because I'm going to say one more time, that plot could not even begin to be thought about until Tuesday night when Judas said, I can help you. They were despairing, can't get it done. We can. So now you've got all that scurrying about. Now there's one other thing that I think happened, and I have it here, actually a couple other things, but on Tuesday night, on that Wednesday. And that is, matter of fact, let me take you to, and I'll pick it up right there. So these are our days. Sunday, presentation, offers himself. Why, given Sunday, why Friday? Monday and Tuesday, proclaims the truth, drives him to a decision. Wednesday's a silent day. Thursday, I like to call a time of messianic preparation. And what I mean by that is it's twofold a time of preparation, because Thursday night is basically, Thursday afternoon and evening is basically the upper room and Gethsemane. And I would say that in the upper room, Jesus is preparing his disciples for what's about to happen. In Gethsemane, he's preparing his own soul spirit. So let me go through it quickly. First of all, let's see what I got here. All right, so a time of messianic preparation. Oh, okay, I'm going to do this. Yeah, let's do it here. In John chapter 12, I'm just going to tell you this. No, I'm not going to take you there. John chapter 12. Folks, I'm taking you somewhere very specific, and I want to follow the chronology, but I think in order to really appreciate what's going on here, it's so important to consider what we're about to consider, against the backdrop of an event which only John records and which happens actually on Tuesday. So if you can take your mind back to all the excitement and Jesus putting to silence his enemies and teaching and so on, and doing miracles. He's doing miracles. Matthew was explicit. He was healing people there on Tuesday. But you have this event where actually some Greeks come and they say, we want to see Jesus, and they're brought to Jesus. And Jesus begins to ponder his own death. I will argue that his primary concern here is his own death. And here's where I'm taking you. And I want to send you home with this in just a little bit. I would argue that, I wouldn't argue. The Bible is absolutely explicit that as the cross drew near, it absolutely terrorized Jesus. He was horrified by the prospect of the cross. Now, people again and again have reacted against that with me. And they say, well, you're making Jesus a coward. No, if he'd have gone back, he'd have been a coward. If he hadn't been horrified, he'd have been insane. Now, I'm going to develop this more tomorrow morning. But let me just say, because I don't want any confusion, when I say that Jesus was horrified by the prospect of the cross, I don't mean the physical suffering of the cross. It was awful. And we'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow morning. But what horrified Jesus was the prospect of being made sin for you and me and be forsaken by the Father. Now listen, I'm going to talk about it tomorrow, but I got to put it on the record right now. Jesus cried out on the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And people, there's a movement right now, at least in my mind, because I keep getting these people getting, he didn't really, that wasn't really forsaken. That's what he said. And the problem people have is they think it's ontological. It has to do with his essence. Somehow the Trinitarian relationship is being dissolved or something. That has nothing to do with that. What we're talking about here, folks, is relationship. And again, I'm going to repeat myself tomorrow because I have to do it for the greater crowd. But please understand that we worship a triune God. Amen and amen? Can you explain that to me? Of course you can explain it. But that's exactly what the Bible teaches. One God, three persons. They're real persons. And the point to be made is, as mysterious as and I love the doctrine of the Trinity for so many reasons. But it's meaningful, deeply so. But one of the most important is this, that we serve a God whose nature it is to exist in relationship from eternity. Three persons. They're distinct. They know each other. They love each other. They like to hang out together. These three persons of the Trinity cherish one another. And in point of fact, it's only because because you are made in the image of God, relationship is everything to you. Honest to goodness, there's nothing in life that is even close to as important as relation. Isn't that true? And so the point is, whatever, I'm going to go back to it, but whatever, all right, given the mystery of a triune God, we know this, that there is between those persons an infinite measure of love and grace. They cherish each other. And whatever that is, and I think we will explore it through eternity and never get to the bottom of it. We'll understand more and more, but never get to the bottom of it. How important and blessed it is that we have this one God who exists from eternity in three persons. Whatever that relationship is, on the cross, the Father is going to judicially disfellowship the Son. In some dim way, and only that, as close as infinity is to finity, you have it reflected in the fall of Adam. He knew what it was to walk in the cool of the day. Now just imagine. And all of a sudden, he's alienated of God. He's angry with God. And God created you with a need for him that only he can fulfill. But go back to it. My point is simply that on the cross, the Father is going to be forsaken in the sense of relationship, judicially disfellowship the Son. And never forget this. That is every bit as awful for the Father as it is for the Son. Now, I'm going to leave it there, and I'm not saying, you can, I don't think we'll ever get to the bottom of that, but I think that concept is so important. The point is, you got to understand, Jesus is trying this on for size. Everything about this experience of humanity, he's learning and and by the way, because I know some people react kind of strongly against it, let's go to Hebrews 5, because it's actually the passage to which we're headed, but that is, it relates to the passage we're headed for. In Hebrews 5, where it says right here, Paul, let's get it on the table, but he's arguing here, the author is arguing that Jesus can be your high priest because he's a priest after the order of Melchizedek. But the first requirement of a priest is that he be one with the people he represents. You can't be a priest unless you really have living the life of those people you represent. And so you have this marvelous statement that though he was a son, go away, though he was a son, I'm in trouble now. Though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. And thus he was perfected and became the author of eternal salvation because he was a priest, a genuine high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And back in Hebrews 4, he had said a quarter before that he is able to be touched. We don't have a high priest who can't be touched with the feeling of our infirmities because he suffered every temptation. So my point is that Jesus is learning, and I go back where I started. The prospect of being forsaken by the Father fills him with terror, all right? Now, I want to pursue that in just a couple minutes, but let me go back first to, what happens is that, I never finished. I'm sorry. I knew I was leaving something out. My mind's a little, let's go back to John 12, because in John 12, as these people come and he begins to talk about his death and how a grain of wheat must fall into the ground and die in order to bear fruit, I think he's encouraging himself, and of course, it applies it to others. But then, in the midst of this, look at John 12 and verse 27. This is stunning, because as he is teaching, all of a sudden, and I picture him maybe grabbing his chest and bending over a little bit, and he says, now my soul is troubled. It's almost like a Shakespearean soliloquy, where he steps to the front of the stage and speaks to and he kind of breaks free, and he says, my soul is, I'm not talking to those people, he says, my soul is troubled, and this is what is troubled over. He says, what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But he says, no, it was for this purpose that I came to this hour. And therefore, folks, he prays the most noble prayer in the pages of Scripture. It's stunning. He simply says, Father, glorify your name. The awfulness, the terror, the suffering, the heartache, I can't imagine. I don't know how I'm going to get through it. But all I'm asking is, Father, you be glorified. And this is real. This is happening. And the Father, this is not a play act. This is happening. And the Father, whose heart is so attuned to that of the Son, and in this moment of anguish, he breaks protocol. And he speaks aloud. And a voice came from heaven saying, I have glorified it and will glorify it again. Folks, that is the promise that Jesus is going to take to the cross. He's going to trust in this. As awful as it is, God promised, my Father promised me he would be glorified, and I'll do it. Now, that's Tuesday afternoon. Let's speed ahead. And what time are we done, Josh? Pardon? Okay. And it's 2:40 now? Have I not been talking for a half hour yet? I can't believe that. But all right. But anyway, wherever in the world we are, 3:15. All right. So that's what I thought, but I kept thinking of it. Here's Thursday. Thursday is a day of messianic preparation. Now, you'll remember what happens. I'm just going to tell you this story. Luke 22, he says to Peter and John, go prepare for the Passover. And they say, well, where should we go? And Jesus says, go into town, you'll meet a man carrying a pitcher of water. Now, understand something. I know that a lot of people, and if you give this any thought, it won't work. But a lot of people think that was omniscience. Now, by the way, did Jesus have the power to know supernaturally? Absolutely, and we'll celebrate every time it happens. I just don't think we should find it here by any means, because it doesn't make any sense. That Peter and John say, where? And Jesus says, I hadn't thought about that, but let me think. If you go into town, I think you'll see a kid. What's that guy doing there? Look, the fact is, I think one of the things that happened on Wednesday was more drama, but Jesus, they're alone in Bethany, and Jesus goes and gets Lazarus alone, says, Lazarus, I need to borrow one of your servants for just a little while. Sure, there he is. So you get that servant aside. Now listen, there's a woman in town. She lives in the most exclusive part of town. She has a large villa. Her name is Mary. She has a son named John Mark. I'd like to borrow her upper room for the Passover tomorrow. And so go ask, and if it's okay, have her have a man carrying a pitcher of water at a certain gate. Now, that is a kind of a stroke of genius signal, because normally men didn't carry water. It was either children or women. But I always say it's not bizarre. It's not like a two-headed chicken. People aren't going to stop and stare. But there's not going to be more than one guy. And so Jesus, and in fact, Peter and John do that. They find that man. First of all, they go and have the lamb sacrifice. I love to talk about that, but now they come and they take him to that upper room and they prepare the Passover. The point is, I think Jesus carefully set that up. Why? Folks, he's keeping the place secret from Judas. He knows what's afoot. And if Judas had known the place, remember, this is what Judas bargained to do, to help arrest him in the absence of the multitude. And that's got to be, it doesn't make any sense, but the Passover. And so Jesus is carefully keeping the place secret. If Judas had known the place, the soldiers would have been there. And there would have been no upper room. There would have been no high priestly prayer. There would have been no Gethsemane. And I think Jesus is orchestrating to have the time that he needs. And during the meal in the upper room, Jesus says, as he begins, he says, you don't know with what desire I have desired to keep this feast with you. And everybody, I think all he's saying is, guys, I have moved heaven and earth to have this time with you. I've worked at this. All right, so then, indeed, Peter and John go, and they would have gone to the temple. They would have had the lamb for 4 days. You were required to have the lamb more or less as a pet. You couldn't put him out to pasture. You had to keep him with you, the Bible says, for 4 days. Why is a little fuzzy, but I think probably simply because lambs are skittish. It could be a big problem, and you're going to have just thousands of lambs, and such a chaotic situation when you take them to the temple. And so just get him used to you, and so that he'll depend on you and so on as you take him to slaughter him. But and then you would take the lamb, and there were so many, I could get into this. There are estimates as to how many lambs had to be slain. And by the way, you're doing this according to the requirements of Exodus, Leviticus. This is how you celebrate Passover. And the lamb had to be slain on the 14th of Nisan between the evenings. Now, most versions have at twilight, but that doesn't make any sense. And what it says literally is between the evenings, because in Israel, we've been there in August, you really depend upon, you just love the afternoon breezes. As the sun beats and the air begins to rise and you get the cool, moist replacement or displacement breezes and so on. Well, that's the first evening, and then when the sun disappears, that's the second evening. So basically, you're talking between about 3 o'clock and 7:30. So you got 4.5 hours, and you got tens and hundreds. I mean, Josephus estimates 200,000 lambs were slain. He tells us that, but in one, that was a few years later. But the point is, and it had to be done in the temple. Now, it was supposed to be done in the court. Most sacrifices were slain in the court of Israel, but on that one day, they decreed that the court of the Gentiles, the big open area that I showed you, would be as the court of Israel. And so the priests, and the lamb had to be slain, and a certain portion of it had to be taken to the altar, and the blood dashed against the altar. And so what they would do is, Josephus says that they had a kind of, like say, Henry Ford, eat your heart out assembly line, way before the fact, because they would have these long lines going out the various doors into the court of the Gentile, and you would find your way. You'd have the lamb, and you'd be holding it close to yourself with all the excitement. And here's what would happen. And there's one element of this that I think I can build a case for, but I'm not absolute. But at any rate, this is a standard sin offering. And given the fact, the history and so on, I think this was a covering for sin. But anyway, in a sin offering, this is what you would do. You would bring the lamb, and you would stand him before you, and you would lean on him like this. Now the Bible says, and it's always translated, lay your hands on him, but it means literally lean your weight on him. And then, and all this would happen in less than a minute, because they had so many lambs. You'd wait in line, and they'd be constantly trading out priests. And so you set the lamb down, lay your head, lean on his shoulders, and then the priest would take, and usually you would bring a family knife, a little short dagger that you're very carefully sharp, and you'd use it pass. So you'd hand that to him, and I think both Peter and John brought one of those, and that's why in the upper room they said, we have 2 swords. Remember, there's probably those 2 Passover swords. But anyway, and so then the priest would deftly, carefully, in the most swift and humane fashion, slice that animal's throat. And you know, I think this is an important reality. The Levitical system, all throughout the Mosaic system, all throughout the ages, was designed to absolutely assault your physical senses, every physical sense. So, and because God's trying to teach you something. So you're leaning on that lamb, his throat is slit, you smell the blood, you hear the death throes of, you watch his eyes roll back. In a few hours you're going to take and eat that meat. And when he collapses, you're going to collapse with him. And you're going to have to get yourself up a little bit and dust yourself off. Why? Why does God put you through that? He's trying to teach you something. And that is, number one, there is a God in heaven who will not tolerate sin. He cannot. He didn't have to deliberate what the wages of sin. By reason of who he is, he cannot tolerate sin. The wages of sin must be death. But that same God is a gracious God who will provide an innocent victim who can die the death you deserve as long as you lean your weight entirely on him. See what's at stake? Now that's what's going on. I think it's there at Passover as well. But at any rate, so you go and the lamb is sacrificed and his throat is slit, and quickly there's a tripod there, and they sling him up by the back legs, and they drain the blood, and they flay him, and they butcher him. And by the way, you got these Levites. Remember, there's one family in the Levitical tribe called the family of Aaron, and they're actually doing the sacrifice. All the other hundreds of thousands of Levites are scurrying about, and they're picking up everything that can be burned or buried, scooping it up, putting in wagons, hauling it out to the Jeshimon where it's going to be burned or buried and so on, and all the blood's going to be carefully washed away. As a matter of fact, here's an interesting thing. All that blood, because when you think of the temple, and even the picture I showed you, I think we tend to think of it as a kind of a cathedral. It's a slaughterhouse. Every day, tens of thousands of lambs, and it has to be maintained in hygienic purity. There are huge steps to make sure that this is kept clean, and one of the most important is there were tons of water which were being brought every day at this period from an aqueduct all the way down to Bethlehem, and it was pumped in beneath the temple where there were huge cisterns and aqueducts and channels and so on, and all of that, all day long there would be donkey trains, and they'd be going down to those cisterns and taking goat bags that have been, remember, take the goat skin, turn it inside out, and tie off the limbs, and then they'd fill that up and throw a bunch of them on the donkeys, and they take them up and they put them in the cisterns just constantly, and now they're taking that and they're washing everything away. And there are channels that carry all of that into the Kidron Valley. Remember the Mount of Olives on the east, and then the Kidron Valley, and here's the Temple Mount. So all of that is, and there's a brook called the Brook Kidron, and all of that is washed in the Brook Kidron, and the Brook Kidron becomes a wadi, that is a riverbed that's dry much of the year, and it makes it all the way down, are you ready for this, to the Dead Sea. Because that Dead Sea, with its salt content 10 times higher than ocean water, is in fact God's sewage treatment plant for the temple. All that's washed down there and just totally destroyed. Now, there's one other point I think that this becomes important, but I go way back to it. So Peter and John go and they offer the sacrifice. Now they go and roast it, probably there at the home. They get it all prepared, and then they then they go back to Bethany, and late in the afternoon, Jesus brings all 12 of them, same route as you saw in the triumphal entry. He's got to go down to the south to find that gate, and then he's going to come, but now he's going to go, rather than the Temple Mount, he's going to go up on that very, very, this is the best part of town. This is the gated community, if you don't mind. It's called the Peter and John ascended. And this is a model again, but this area called the Upper City, I won't get into the geography. Well, one thing, this right here, because I want to come back to it. Well, actually, I'll have to do it tomorrow. This is Herod's palace. That is, King Herod, who built this city, died just days after Jesus was born, after trying to kill the baby Jesus. He had built himself a marvelous, beautiful, they're just really beginning to understand. the dynamics of that palace. It's about a fifth of a mile long, but at any rate, that's the Western Hill, and the place where Jesus kept the Last Supper is marked right there, so also high on the Western Hill, and the upper city, as it's called here. So at any rate, Jesus goes and keeps the Passover with the 12. Now, I'm going to be very quick with this. I have to, forgive me. But what happens, of course, is that as they enter the room, there is a dispute over who should be greatest in the kingdom. And I think that's probably a function of Jesus' promise that they would sit on 12 thrones over 12 tribes. And some of those tribes are bigger than others. You know, I don't want Gad or Dan, for heaven's sakes. You know, I'm looking for... And so and it probably has to do with how they're sitting around the table. And the table is, in fact, a triclinium. It's a low, three-sided table. Let's see if I've got a... No, I guess I don't. I got some pictures. You find them. But it's just a low three-sided table. It has pillows around it. It's open on one... U-shaped is what I say, three-sided. And then there's one end open for the servant, because he would... there is no servant. But the point is that you're laying on pillows, and the table is about that high, and one of the dynamics of that is that again, I say with regard to Da Vinci's Last Supper, probably good art, but really, really bad history. So you got to get that out of your head. And 13 guys all on the far side of the table facing the artist and so on, probably not, but on tables, so you can't. They're reclining. They're reclining like this. Sometimes I do a little shtick, but I can't take the time. But they're in a position like this. This is basically the table's here, and if I'm Jesus, this would be John. That makes sense to you? The open end of the table is there. It goes that way, and then there are pillows all the way around, and you basically assume this posture because you're reclined to eat. It's not a meal. It's a feast that includes a meal. It's going to go on for several hours, and so you would assume this position, and I think that Jesus is, wherever Jesus is, John is next to him, and therefore if I'm John and Jesus is behind me and I want to say something quiet to him, I just lean back, and that's known as the disciple who leaned on Jesus' breast. That's more or less the formal designation of where you're sitting. You're leaning on the person behind, or to your left, and behind is Judas. And what happened? And by the way, the other one we can position is Peter, because he evidently moved a little slow with it. And the point to be made is that the closer you're sitting to the captain of the feast, namely Jesus, the more important you are. That's what they're fighting over, I think, is who's going to sit close to Jesus. And this is what James and John get their mother to ask for. Sit right next to him at the feast, which is the kingdom to come. So the point is that Jesus... All right, so they're thus arranged, and their feet are sticking out for the whole world to see. It's a faux pas, once again, to enter a formal feast room with soiled feet. And so there would be a basin and a towel, and normally there would be a servant, but it's a borrowed room. So I think each of the disciples, as they entered the room, they kind of had to, get their skirts down a little bit, hope nobody noticed that their feet were all soiled. Now they're sitting there. Jesus sees it, gets up and washes the disciples' feet. Stunning. And then... as a matter of fact, let me just say it. When he comes to Peter, you remember Peter says, "No, I won't let you do it." And Jesus says, "What I am doing, you don't understand, but you will hereafter." Remember that? And then Peter absolutely refused, and Jesus said, "Well, then you don't have any part with me." And so Peter says, "Give me a bath." And Jesus says, "No, you're clean. I just got all of you are clean except one." And then Jesus gets up and goes back and sits down. And when he says to Peter, "What I am doing now you don't understand, but you shall hereafter," that's almost always, and this is a thing with me. When you're reading these narratives, celebrate the mundane. You don't need some lofty spiritual. It might be there, but don't find it if it's not there. And look for just the story. And I think what Jesus is saying, he comes to Peter, and Peter says, "No, never. You'll know." And Jesus says, "You don't understand now, but you will hereafter." And everybody thinks that means that you go to Acts and Peter grew and now he understands servant leadership. Maybe so. I don't think so, frankly. I think Jesus is saying, "Peter, I'm trying to make a point here. Will you play along? I'm going to explain it in just a minute." And finally, of course, he does. And so now Jesus sits down to explain it. And he says, "You call me Master and Lord," and you say, "Well, For so I am. If I then, your Lord and Master, I like to ask people, if I then, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, how do you finish that at your house? If I washed your feet, wouldn't you say, you got to wash my feet? Well, I think if that's what Jesus said, any one of us would be happy to do it, but he said something much more difficult. If I've washed your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet. And this is in the face of this attempt to have the greater seats. Well, at any rate, so they keep the Passover, and the Passover being ended, and Judas is still in the room, Jesus announces that the betrayer is at the table. Now, when he does that, everybody starts to say, who could it be? And Judas, this is really telling, Judas leans over, because he's right next to Jesus, and he asks him, I would say privately, he says, Master, is it I? And Jesus says, in the strongest way to say it, absolutely it is. Well, now all pretense is over. If he had any hope of surreptitious, and now he's got a decision to make. And he sits there and he thinks he's got 30 pieces of silver jangling in his pocket. He's got 600 soldiers and a whole body of the Sanhedrin and Pilate's judicial apparatus, all waiting to get done what can't happen until he, and I imagine he's mad because he realizes he's been snookered. You know, I mean, Jesus has kept it secret. I picture all day on that Silent Wednesday, Judas wandering from one apostle to the other saying, hey, Matthew, you got any idea where we're going to be keeping the Lord's Supper? Have you heard anything? No, I don't know anything. You know, he's desperate to find out. And now he comes and Jesus leads him. And let me say one other thing with regard, when Jesus took him, I think they probably anticipated, I mean, they had been staying in Bethany, but they couldn't keep the Passover in Bethany because you couldn't see. Did I tell you that they had interpreted to mean you had to have an eyesight? And so they probably anticipated taking their own tents and kind of buttoning them together and having enough place where they get inside. But now Jesus takes them up to the most exclusive neighborhood in Jerusalem. It's the gated, as it were. It's huge villas. I think very possibly most of those apostles had never been in a house this nice. And once again, I think they're saying to themselves, we are on a roll here. This is a good thing. And now and then what happens is, Judas still being at the table, supper being ended, Jesus announces the betrayer is here, and they all say, who could it be? And Judas says, is it I? And this is where Peter, who evidently didn't move very fast, made motion to John, ask him who it is. And so I think privately, John asked Jesus, and Jesus told him privately, the one to whom I give the sop. And you know, evidently, as best we can tell, they would take the Passover lamb and they would make it roasted and make it into a bit of a mash, and then there'd be individual loaves of bread. There would be other elements, but you'd tear a piece off, and if you got a nice morsel, you might hand it to a neighbor. It was just an act of fraternity. And so Jesus does that, and I'm going to say again, sin makes you stupid. And you know, by the way, Judas was the only sophisticated in the crowd. He was a Judean. He was a kind of a white-collar guy. All the others were Galileans, you know, dirt under their fingernails and so on. But Judas, he was given the bag, so he's much trusted. He's sitting right next to Jesus. Now Jesus does really just a very nice fraternal thing and hands him a morsel. And I think there were probably 6 or 7 guys who went nuts. There went Judah, you know what I'm saying? But the fact is that Satan uses that. And so Judas gets up to leave. And of course he makes excuses, and the others think he's going to buy something against the feast. That really fits very, very well. And Jesus says, what you're going to do quickly. And he sets out. Now this is the reason I started out with John 12 here, because I want you, now John 13, remember, hold on here, in John 12, Jesus had prayed, Father, glorify your name, and the Father had promised to do that. Now you go to John 13, and you have John's telling of the upper room, but notice, and he tells about how he gives here it is, he says, what you do quickly, and look at verse 30. Having received the piece of bread, Judas went out immediately. It was night. By now it's somewhere toward 11 o'clock or so. I mean, they couldn't begin the feast until after the sundown, and they've been at it, and the whole feast is over, and even more. He went out, and then Jesus turned to the 11. Now hear this. And he said, when Judas had gone out, Jesus said, now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. What is he saying? He's saying the game is afoot. The curtain has gone up. The drama has begun. Judas has gone to fetch the Sanhedrists. Now, in order to do that, Judas is going to have to go way up to the north of the city, to the northwest corner of the Temple Mount, where there is a fortress called the Antonia, and that's where the soldiers would be, waiting to find out where Jesus is so they can go to arrest him. So here it is. Judas is here. But let me make sure I don't miss the point. Jesus understands that now the drama has begun. And so it's late on Thursday night. Judas has gone to fetch the Sanhedrists. And here's a map. Again, Jesus is here. This is the site of the Last Supper. Oh, I probably give it to you. Yeah, okay. So and then Judas up here, do you see this right here? That's the Fortress Antonia. And so Judas is going to have to make his way all the way, and that's on this map, up to the Fortress Antonia. After he leaves, Jesus begins to preach. This is the upper room discourse, and you have John 14, let not your heart be troubled, and so on. And he begins to preach, and a lot of times John 14, 15, 16 they are grouped together as the upper room discourse. Not quite, because at the end of John 14 verse 31, Jesus says, let me fast forward way down there. Jesus says very abruptly, he says, right there, the last verse, arise, let us go from here. Now the apostles, the 11, would have fully expected to lay back and go to sleep. They had these big cushions, that's the normal thing. And they were tired. This is a culture where the sun goes down, you go down. And so they're ready for sleep. And all of a sudden Jesus says, let's go from here. Why? Well, because what's going to happen is Judas is going to make his way up here to the Fortress Antonia, and then what's he going to do? He's going to make his way back, and he's got 600 soldiers. He may have to choose a different route, but many of them are going to make their way back, and that's what you have here, to the upper room, because that's where Jesus was when Judas left him. And he fully expected. He thought that he'd probably just go back and fall asleep. So Judas figures he's got him, and yet he makes his way up that outdoor staircase and bursts into the upper room. And by the way, I shouldn't say this, but this portion of the city right here has been more thoroughly excavated, dug archaeologically, than any other part of the ancient city, because that's where most of the fighting was in 1967, and it was devastated. So by the time Israel took the city, of the old city, in 1967, in June, that was pretty well totally decimated, and so they were able to dig there. Now today it's all built up with the finest homes in Jerusalem and so on, but underneath are all these digs. And so they know a lot about this, and I have to take you there to show you why we can be confident where the upper room was. But the point is, Judas is going to come back there and find it empty. Now, at this point, John gives us a little insight that's very helpful. Oh, by the way, so now Jesus is going to make his way, here it is, got to find that gate. He's going to come out, and then it's all the way up the Valley of Kidron to another little garden farm. In this case, it's an olive oil production facility, but he's going to come down to a place called Gethsemane. Gethsemane means olive press. And evidently, this is a place that someone who is a follower of Jesus allowed him to go. When you go to Gethsemane, insist on finding the cave. Nobody goes to the cave. The cave's a really interesting part, because there was an olive grove, but down on the side of the hill, part of the same unit, but down on the side of the hill, there was a cave, and there is a first century olive press in that cave, and clearly that's a first century, it is Gethsemane, and I think the point is that Jesus would often go there because it was a good place. It was secure, it was warm in the winter and cool in the summer, and John tells us, this is such an insight, John 18 and verse 2. As a matter of fact, let me get two things. Oh, so I never finished the thought. He says, arise, let us go from here, and all the way down, as he makes his way through the gate and all the way down here, Jesus is teaching John 15 and 16. So all that happens, he says in 14:31, let's get out of here, because he wants the extra time. He's not fleeing, but he wants the extra time. And so now he makes his way all the way out to Gethsemane, and along the way he is preaching. And then John 17, he prays that marvelous high priestly prayer. But then, so John 15 and 16 on the way, and somewhere along the way, perhaps low on the hillside, He prays the prayer of John 17, but now we come with some seasickness perhaps. We come to John 18, and it's talking about the high priestly prayer, but it says this: when he had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron. And it seems to me that very possibly, that's the brook that I mentioned before, but I think very possibly John mentions that here because you see it was the drainage ditch for the temple. And that afternoon, tens of thousands of lambs have been slain. So that brook is running red with the blood of those Passover lambs, every one of which is just a picture of what is about to happen to Jesus. And so I think there's some poignancy in he steps over the brook Kidron, and then it says, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. And then you have this remarkable statement right here in verse 2. It's kind of a throwaway, but, and Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, for Jesus often met there, stayed there, it means, with his apostles. So this was a place where they had often stayed, and here's Judas. He goes busting into the that upper room, nobody there. He's got 600 soldiers anxious to arrest somebody, for heaven's sakes. And so he's got 30 pieces of silver. He owes somebody something. So he says, don't worry, guys, there's only one place. And this makes sense, honest to goodness. The city is crowded beyond what you can imagine. And so where can Jesus go with 11 companions in the middle of the night? I know where he must have gone. So Judas does exactly the same thing. He makes his way out to the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, in the meanwhile, Jesus is able to finish that teaching and then spend that season of prayer with in Gethsemane. I'll come back to that in just a moment. Here's an interesting sidelight. Mark 12, and only Mark says, the only one of the four Gospels that mentions that, is that when Jesus was arrested in the garden, there was a young man there. Remember this guy? A young man clad in nothing but a sheet. And when the Roman soldiers challenged him, I always say this may have a hard time finding a flannelgraph for this picture. Because when they challenged him, he fled sans sheet. Remember that? I think that's probably almost certainly John Mark. Now, I'd have to go to the book of Acts to show you, but think about what it means. We discover, you put the pieces together in Acts, that this is in fact the home of Mary, the mother of Mark, and he's a young teenager, and he's asleep, and all this commotion with all these soldiers and so on, so he throws a sheet around himself and follows them out there, and that's why he's out there. Now, so Jesus comes out, and I want to conclude here with the incident in the. I shouldn't have done that, but that's all right. It'll work. Here, Gethsemane, and we're going to conclude with this. Yeah, we'll have to. You know, I want to be ready for the Roman trials in the morning, but we'll do the Jewish trials in 5 minutes, and then we'll go to the Roman trials. I was going to try and get there. This is a good place to end. It's Thursday. And I started out by saying that I think it's so important that we embrace what the Bible teaches so clearly about the terror of our Savior as he faced the cross. And I'm going to say again, it was not a function of the physical suffering. It was a function of what he was about to endure as a sin sacrifice for you and me. And I think artists of every medium and of every age can quite easily represent physical suffering. But how do you communicate spiritual suffering, spiritual agony, bottomless despair? How do you represent that? It's much more difficult. And I think that's what Gethsemane is all about. And it's my persuasion that you're really never going to be able to embrace, or let's say it this way, that Golgotha is not going to get its arms around you unless Gethsemane does first. We got to come to grips with Gethsemane. And there's a certain degree to which it almost seems impertinent or impolite for us to be looking upon this marvelously intimate scene between Father and Son. But God wants you to be confronted with this. It's hugely important. And I think it's because this is the way by which God in history and narrative puts on display the indescribable, indefinable depth of Jesus' terror. No, the depth of the terrors of the cross. Because it's as he ponders that he lives out this experience. Now, you know the experience well. I don't have to dwell on it, but they come. It's, like I say, it's a working farm. It's an olive oil production plant. And there are olive trees, of course. And those trees, many believe, are still there, and could be. But I think you can know that you're in the airspace of the garden when you go to Gethsemane today because of that cave. The giveaway is the cave. But the point is that that cave has been actually been enlarged so it can be a Catholic church, but it's still worth stopping in for sure. But the point is that Jesus takes his disciples in, and I think he probably took them first to the cave. And again, they sleep here quite often. They probably got their favorite, they might have a bedroll in the corner somewhere, okay, fine, let's get to bed. And Jesus says, please, this is what he says, my soul is heavy in me unto death. Please watch and pray. Let me tell you, one dynamic with regard to what we've talked about before, taking Jesus' humanity very seriously, is you realize this. Now, carefully contemplate this for a minute. During this period on earth, Jesus had no more spiritual resources than you or I. And he was absolutely dependent upon those. And one of the most important to him was prayer. He believed in prayer. He believed in intercessory prayer. Before he made one of the most important decisions of his ministry, choosing 12 apostles, he spent a whole night in prayer. Folks, that is not play acting. He is not trying, and he is, listen, some people say, well, prayer doesn't really make any, this is a big thing today. Prayer doesn't make any difference. God just wants you to have the same spirit that he has, so he asks you to pray, so you come around to his way of thinking. Think Jesus needed that? Jesus believed in prayer, that God uses prayer, and so he begged his disciples, please watch and pray. And then he left 8 there, and he went into the garden itself, up the hill and into the garden itself. And again, he said to his disciples, please watch and pray. And then he goes in, and you know the story. He throws himself on the earth 3 times, and he prays, Father, if there be any way, let this cup pass from me. Now, what is stunning, I think, and instructive is to compare that to John chapter 12. On Tuesday, he thought about that prayer. What shall I pray? Deliver me from this hour? No. It was for this reason that I came to this hour. Glorify yourself. And now, with the cross immediately on the horizon, Jesus 3 times begs the Father, don't try and interpret that away. If there be any way, let this cup pass from me. But nonetheless, not my will, but thine be done. Now, do you hear what I'm saying? That what he refused to pray on Tuesday, he prayed 3 times with as earnestly as he possibly could. Now, that doesn't take anything away from who Jesus was. It just helps us understand the depth of what he was about to endure. And Luke gives us these 2 insights that are rather stunning, where he says, number 1, in verse 43, an angel appeared to heaven straight from heaven. Folks, think about this. There's only one other time when Jesus was at such an extremity. He was at such physical weakness and so on, that the Father, the only other time is after a fast of 40 days. Now understand what's going on there, by the way, in the temptation, in the wilderness experience, I like to call it. He fasted for 40 days, endured the temptation, refused to yield to the temptation, but the Father sent angels to do for Jesus what you and I would have done for him. Angels can't do miracles, but they can make him comfortable, get him food, dress his sores, and for several weeks, I think, probably months, those angels ministered to Jesus to get his strength back. But God, the Father sent angels because Jesus was at such a distress that he needed help, and there was nobody there to do it. Well, now, it's not by reason of a 40-day fast, it's by reason of the contemplation of what he was about to endure for you and me. That the Father, I don't know what those angels did. I was picturing maybe just lifting him up off the ground, and maybe it's with angelic help that he staggers out of the garden because he's so overwhelmed, he's so horrified by what he's about to endure. And then, of course, Dr. Luke also says that he sweat great drops of blood in a timeout. I know that there's a text issue here. I've done my homework. This is Scripture. And I understand why in a few texts it's been removed. And the reason it was removed, because people thought it was beneath Jesus to behave in this way. It is not. And the fact is that he's not doing this for our benefit. He's doing it because he is horrified. And he needs the Father's help. And so he is praying, and he finally says, not my will, but thine be done. So now he gets up and staggers, perhaps with angelic help, out of the garden. We'll pick it up here in the morning, but what happens is that he goes and he wakes, first of all, the 3 disciples. They're sleeping, and then he goes and wakes the other 8, and he leaves the garden. And at this time, here comes Judas up the Kidron Valley. Judas, 600 soldiers, Sanhedrinists, come storming down the valley, and let me cover this real quickly. It's most carefully recorded in John, but what happens is that they come to these, and of course the disciples. Can you imagine? This has been a pretty good week so far. And Jesus was warned at the upper room, but now they look up. Here comes Judas. They love him. He's a trusted brother. He's part of the number. What's he doing? They've got a bunch of Sanhedrins, and they're obviously mad and excited. And then he's got a whole cohort of closely ranged soldiers. Now you have to understand that the Roman, listen, there was no country in the Roman Empire that was more trouble with sedition than Israel. It happened again and again, and there was no country where it was harder for the Romans to put it down, because they were so good. I like to say that the land of Israel is like one giant paintball arcade. It's just made for guerrilla warfare. And the Jews were so good at it, they'd set these ambushes and these traps, and they'd spring. So you're a soldier. You've never seen one of these. You've been assigned to the Antonia. You bet you were trained about how these people rebel. And now comes the moment. There's a sedition afoot. We have to go and arrest the seditionists. So they're on high alert, and they've got all their weapons and so on, and they come marching down, and this is an incendiary thing. And let me tell you one other thing. The Romans do not worry about collateral damage, okay? They rather celebrate it. So they don't mind spilling a little blood tonight. They fully anticipate they're going to do it, and they don't want it to be theirs. And they never know but what somebody's going to come springing out and try and separate them and so on. So they're on high alert. They come marching down, and Judas comes and gives them a kiss and so on, and here come the soldiers. And somewhere in that melee, Peter takes out his sword and chops off the ear of the high priest. And Jesus somehow picks it up and he heals the man's ear. Now, to me, that's about the second most amazing thing that happened that night. The first most amazing being that the rest of the soldiers went on with it. If I saw that, guys, you're on your own. I'm going home tonight. But nonetheless, what happens is this, and it's really dramatic. As the soldiers come, Jesus steps forward, and he says, who is it you're arresting? Who have you come to arrest? And I picture maybe the captain opening up the warrant, Jesus of Nazareth, I am he. So he says, I'm the one. Let them go. And Jesus he had prayed in his high priestly prayer that the Father would protect those whom he had protected. And now he takes careful steps. And so he's, I am the one. And so Jesus is finally, there's a lot of commotion and fall. I know the people fall back. I know there are a lot of, remember when he said, I am he, they all fall back, and so on, John 19. I celebrate the mundane. I think they were all on high alert, and they expected a war. He says, I'm the guy. They go, whoa. I think it's the Keystone Cops making an arrest, if you know what I'm saying. I think they just begin to fall over each other and so on. But all the point is that he is arrested. His disciples desert him, and now it's Thursday night. He is taken back up to the priestly villa, where Caiaphas has this priestly villa, and he's going to be tried, first of all, by the Jews and then by the Romans, and by 6 o'clock in the morning, he's going to be turned over to be crucified. So we'll pick it up there, folks. Sunday, day of Messianic presentation, right? He's offering himself as Messiah. He set it up. He rode in. The city had been alerted to his coming, exploded in happy excitement. Goes back to Bethany, given Sunday, why Friday, Monday and Tuesday, days of Messianic proclamation. So Jesus seizes the temple and behaves more messianically and puts all of his enemies to silence and open debate and pronounces these curses. But as he leaves the city, he pronounces these woes upon the scribes and the Pharisees, and he's driving the city to a decision. Tuesday night, Judas sneaks off, makes the bargain. We can get it done, so the plot is laid. Wednesday, a busy, busy day, trying to get everything ready for the arrest and trial and so on. And then Thursday, day of messianic preparation in the upper room. Jesus sends Peter and John to a place he'd arranged. They set up for the Passover. They keep the Passover. I didn't mention that after Judas is left, of course, he introduces the Lord's Supper, begins to teach. Suddenly, let's go from here. Makes his way down to Gethsemane. Meanwhile, Judas has made his way with the soldiers back to the upper room. Nobody there. He follows the same path. And Jesus has that stunning and important season in prayer with his Father. And then, as he emerges from the Garden of Gethsemane, here comes Judas with the soldiers, and Jesus is arrested. All right, so we'll leave it there and pick it up in the morning.